Hello. Hi, Fiona. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to start if with a quick word about Fiona's film, Sometimes Biting, Sometimes Bit, which I personally found extremely moving, a rich source of reflection, and a piece that was highly evocative, I felt, of a sense of place and certainly of time as well. So I wanted to start by asking um, in what way you came to the film, because the film is clearly inspired by the book, Ridley Walker, but it makes very few direct references to it. And I was wondering about the process that took you from your appreciation of the book to the making of the film.
So I first read Ridley Walker nearly 20 years ago, and it really took up residence in my mind. So I suppose I've been wanting to kind of make a piece of work um, from the novel for a long time, but it's been quite a slow process of what that might be. And my understanding of the geography of East has really been shaped by the novel as this sort of circle of towns with Canterbury at its centre. And that was the original intent, was to sort of follow that full circle nine-wise rhyme. But actually, I suppose quite rightly, the film's been really shaped by things that have been outside of my control, like the emergence of coronavirus and funding implications and things like that. So in the end, it's been a much more specific locations that really spoke to these ideas around power and fragility that were sort of, for me, the sort of beating heart of the book, and also how I wanted to talk about certain things that are happening in our time and the kind of disaster that we are moving so relentlessly towards, basically. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, we'll obviously come on to the subject of Anthropocene in a bit more detail, but for now, I was just wondering about the form of the film. One of the things that struck me was the importance of sound as well as text to the film. And you use different registers, different modes of discourse in the film. You use poetry, you use a more scientific register, a kind of stream of consciousness monologue element. And the sound itself seems to have a certain visceral quality to it. And it seems to provoke an effective response in the viewer in its own right. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your use of sound, what the thinking was behind it.
Sure. I think there's a lot of ideas that are entwined in the sound. So the film opens with a really strong rhythm, a pulsation, and there's that feeling that something is unspoken and determined, and there's this kind of absolute that's pulling you through the narrative or the time scale. That had to be right up front because it just runs through everything. And then there's the way that the music and the field sound interact and almost bleed into one another. So a lot of the field sound has been slowed down, and that's to bring, I think, this sense of the ordinary world and another kind of undercurrent, this sort of mysterious and powerful non-ordinary world that's nested inside of it, in a way that, to me, it both speaks about a kind of the potential for an area of consciousness that might be outside the individual, that's something that we share, but also something about our shared materiality and how that vibrates together. And then there's also this, the music, this incredible work by Xenia Pestova Bennett. And that was one of those serendipities that happened, that I heard it on the radio on a day where the first day of filming, basically. It was on radio. She was talking about this music that was inspired by the decay of atomic particles. So it was just obviously a very memorable moment and really stayed with me.
Yeah. And the music's beautiful.
And then it fits so well, doesn't it? I mean, it was just like a kind of magic putting those things together, and especially maybe with the murmuration sequence and her music.
Yeah.
But then again, in terms of the text and these different registers, so there's aspects which is shared by all my work, thinking about wanting to bring together these different voices and different ways of knowing. And that
Mm-hmm.
idea about ways of knowing is a really strong theme in the book. You know, the
Yeah.
first knowing, which might translate as intuition,
Yeah,
or that kind
sure.
of deep in the bone. Yeah. And then the cleverness, that kind of addictive, controlling,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
ultimately rather disastrous knowledge that sets humans apart, but it's almost like we're not in control of either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I really wanted to bring these kind of ways of thinking, ways of knowing, understanding together, and
Mm-hmm.
hear them together. And obviously, you know, those poetic words are voiced by you in that amazing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, liquid, expressive voice that you have. And then my rather more dry tones, but trying to
Mm-hmm.
kind of think about how science and cleverness might be really informed by these deep places of emotional connection.
Yeah, so it's very interesting how you bring those two modalities together so well. There's very much a sense that we are being asked to analyze the state of things at the moment, but at the same
Mm.
time enter into a space of reflection as well, where we lose our sense of place and time in a way. So there's this overlapping of different registers, different modalities, which I found alluring but also discomforting at the same time. The
Yeah.
sense that you're playing with these levels of awareness, you know, which go beyond and beneath what we tend to be used to or to acknowledge often. But also, I was aware that in terms of the use of imagery, there's a lot that seems a little bit hallucinogenic, you know, about the way that
Mm.
that we're asked to view, to see. So, what was you kind of thinking around some of the use of imagery? What were you looking to affect within the viewer?
Yeah. I think that it has to do really with my understanding of how partial my human senses are, really. Sometimes I feel like I'm quite a bad animal. You know, when I'm in the woods or something, I feel like I miss so much. And it was also thinking about how, for example, the shining ram's horn snail, how does that snail perceive its own world? What fills its perceptual field?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, I've got these kind of clunky ways of approaching that. Perhaps, you know, you can't think that my use of film techniques can really approach that. But I filmed the snail using this little microscope attachment for my phone camera. So that snail's tiny. It's only about 6 millimeters across. And here,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it fills the screen, it fills our vision. And I find that really visually exciting, but also emotionally, so it's sort of thrilling because it's kind of a non-human-ish kind of view.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and
and
it's quite.
then
Carry
go
on,
on.
sorry. No, Karen, please.
Well, no, I was just thinking about how then, you know, really that scene, that snail, then leads into a digitized effect. And I suppose I was thinking about those as a kind of way of thinking about techno, visceral, conceptual pollution of the world by us, by capitalism, you know, everything becoming a bit like a barcode or a bit like an oil
Mm.
slick, or, you know,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, over those images of the snail, which are very much foregrounded in relation to, you know, these images of power stations and, you know, other, as you say, sort of monuments of capitalism. One of the kind of
Mm.
interesting things is kind of you then start talking about the pollutants that have entered into the water, the snail's habitat. And I found that despite the fact that you're enumerating data in a way, I found that incredibly moving because it's about a trail of destruction, you know, which in a way is what the film is about as well. Um,
Yeah.
but I also wanted to ask you about a concept that kept coming up in my mind as I was watching the film, which is related to a quote that appears in film, which if I can remember it, it's, do you remember how we used to listen into the dark arena of the night? How in the darkness we learned who we were. And this reminded me somewhat of the concept of solastalgia, which was coined by philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And as far as I can describe it, this term, solastalgia, describes a nostalgia for the loss of the feeling of solace that you derive from a place close to home. So it's a feeling of distress associated with environmental change close to your home when that place is being violated. So I picked up on this kind of feeling that resonates throughout your film, and I was wondering how, you know, if you had a conscious sense that you were evoking such a concept, such a feeling.
I think there's sort of two things for me in that. One of which is that I'm reaching for something that's kind of out of my grasp, a sort of deep belonging to the land, a sort of way of being that's perhaps lost to us, or we lost access to in the modern Western world because of that sustained attack on that connectivity from patriarchy, from Enlightenment thinking, from monotheism. But also there's the literal thing of how in my lifetime, in my 50 years, we've destroyed 50% of life on the planet, and we still don't seem prepared to stop. And obviously those two aspects are, you know, connected.
Thank you. There was also
before we I was just thinking, before we run out of time, there's something that I really wanted to ask you about your piece. So sort of thinking about that kind of the loss of indigeneity that I kind of just touched on, and I feel like I have to sort of tread really carefully around, because, you know, I'm a white Western woman, just don't want to be coming in and taking something. And I have an experience of childhood which was very rural, and I read a lot of books in which animals were the central protagonists, and I didn't feel as a child that there was a very distinct difference between the interior lives of animals and plants and humans. It's like all of us were mysterious and deep. And then I wanted to pick up on that and ask you about that, but also when we talked earlier, you were mentioning how the reader escapes nothing in Ridley Walker. We get enmeshed in, and we become complicit with every dark drive that the protagonists and communities of the book are drawn into and pursue. And I wonder if you could say something about how you see these sort of colonial forces playing out in the novel.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a straightforward kind of analysis. There is very definitely a relationship between the book and colonialism, and it's not just colonialism; it's colonialism in its different forms, and that includes, you know, slavery, as far as I'm concerned. But what I see as some of the key aspects of this are the fact that the protagonists within the book are effectively have been untethered from their past, from their collective past, from their own cultural memory. And this is one of the, obviously, the key deficits of colonialism. Often when we think about colonialism, we imagine, or we think about it in relation to societies distant from our own, societies that are perceived as aliens somehow. But this book has found a way to turn this process of alienation in and itself, so that the society of the perpetrators, those who impose colonialism upon others, this has then become the alienated society, which we then observe from a distance, if you will, where those protagonists have become, you know, indigenous elements within their own right. So I kind of find it interesting, because they're always within the book these several layers, multi-layers. You know, it's not just a sense of ambivalence and doubleness, as I mentioned in the audio piece. It's far more than that. You know, there are multifaceted levels of meaning and ways that you can enter, you know, the drama of this piece, but also clearly by basically situating quite clearly recognizable people, you know, elements, people within the society that we know so well. However dispersed they are in time, there are certainly elements of the way they live that are highly recognizable to us, largely through the artifacts of the past, you know, which is our present. They feature quite strongly, although in the background of the film. So there's a sense in which the processes of life, the way that Indigenous people live their lives, are brought up front so that we can feel a degree of empathy with them. But the way in which you know, the way in which this is expressed, there are numerous ways in which this is expressed. It's expressed in the fragmentation of the language, for example, in the way that Russell Hoban somehow managed to give a sense of creolization, you know, that occurs when you have this collision of different types of society and different types of culture, but also in the worldview of many Indigenous societies where different forms of life are given an equivalent value to the human. So there is a way, I know we've mentioned Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter in the past, which is an attempt in a way to update the notion of animated life, all forms of being, in a way, being animate, or all forms of, you can't necessarily, it's not necessarily life in the way that we consider it. So all forms, all types of entities are given some kind of animating principle, which is obviously something that Indigenous societies are very clear about. Within the book, you see this happen in different ways. One of the things that I was very entranced by was the character of Listener, and the way Listener somehow has the capacity to form a reciprocal relationship with the earth, so that he has the capacity to tune into geomagnetic forces, into radio waves, into, you know, presumably the residual particulates of the radioactive destruction that, you know, that occurred in the past. So he has these capacities, which, in my very humble opinion, I'm pretty sure that humankind shared with other species, you know, in the past, sometime in the distant past. And the book Ridley Walker enables you to feel these capacities, you know, without necessarily understanding or seeking to understand them fully, but you feel what it's like to be in that kind of life world.
I mean, the way that matter is written, I find really fascinating, in the sense that, you know, when they're collecting the ingredients for one small one together, it really feels like they have so much agency within that. It's almost like they're moving the people around on this sort of chessboard of inland to get what they want, to come together, to create. I'm aware that we're sort of
we are short of time. Yes, I'm aware.
Yeah, I just want to open the space up for questions, for people to put questions in the chat if Sonia's seeing.
We can take questions from the chat now, or if you prefer, if people want to take a little bit more time to digest, we could always have questions at the end of this session with everybody together.
Okay, I mean, lots of discussion of animals earlier. Did you see that, Fiona?
What's that?
So there was a question that came up. So there've been lots of discussion about animals. What about plant life?
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think of, you know, that he sort of talks movingly about the downs and about how they've been, you know, changed, are in the process of change. And at one point he's walking through a place and he's sort of aware that, you know, they're at this tipping point between hunter-gatherer culture and farming culture, aren't they? And it feels like the farmers are perhaps, you know, getting the upper hand and pushing the hunter-gatherers out a bit. And he's sort of saying he couldn't really explain why he didn't want the place to change, but he didn't want it to change. He wanted those little woodlings to stay exactly as they are. And I get it sort of this, that he's in a sort of resonant conversation with this landscape the whole way through, that it's sort of calling him, as well as the dogs, as well as the, you know, listener pulled the dog and the dog pulled him, but there's a sense that they're all in a sort of dynamic space that is very active.
Exactly. I mean, the activeness doesn't have to be confined to creatures that can move, you know, or that can move over distance, you know. But a question came up, a point came up from Silvio. He said, all this takes place in the wood, which is entirely true.
There is a question that's coming from who says, Fiona, can you talk about your experience and reflections of being and working on foot in the Kent landscape, and how the experience of being on foot in the landscape, making this and other work, caused you to decide not to make the film based on the circular pilgrimage?
Basically, it was COVID that made that very difficult. So the plan was to do a sort of circular walk and meet people along the way. So obviously that wasn't possible. But the experience of being in the Kent landscape sort of has informed everything I do. So a move from living in London to living in a rural place in Kent has been completely transformative in the way that I work as an artist and think about working with places and with species.
So I'd like to welcome Sarah Trillo now. Sarah, hello.
Hi,
Sarah.
everyone.
Put your slides up, just a second.
I might just turn my camera off again, okay? But hello, everyone.
It's lovely to have you with us. Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah's going to talk about her ongoing project, Lomia, I hope I've said that right, for which she's been making artefacts and writing about a fictitious island in the English Channel, facing immersion by the sea, so definite shades of the realm there. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, as Sonia said, I'm going to share some diary extracts from my current project, Lomia. Lomia, L-O-M-E-A, an island, a submerging island, sinking into the English Channel opposite the East Kent coast. The water is encroaching. For years, the government promised to fund a seawall, but the money went to coastal defences in Romney Marsh instead. Every month, the land recedes a bit more, swallowed by the sea. We estimate that in the next 10 years, we'll have to move to the mainland. Already, our island has become two, divided by a channel that has formed over the past few years, the water surging ever more deeply through the chalk, now impossible to cross without a boat. The part of the island we live on has two hills at the centre. The highest, adjacent to the chapel, was perhaps an Iron Age burial mound, and this is where our goats and sheep graze and the geese roam. Once there was enough pasture and woodland on the island to support a whole village, but this is the only meadowland left now, along with the weather-beaten trees scattered here and there. As it became increasingly hard to scrape a living on the island, and the periodic storms had more devastating effect, most of the villagers left. Their homes have slowly become ruins and are disappearing amongst brambles and ditches. Now there are just a scattering of houses left occupied. The Lamia hoard consists of ceramic artefacts of unknown age. They were found on the northwest coast of the island when digging took place to create a seawall, a site which has since been submerged. Their form bears a striking resemblance to leaf-shaped copper pendants excavated at the Abbey Farm villa site in Minster, Thanet. This Roman villa would have been built to have a view of the Wonsum Channel and across the sea to Lamia, and these artefacts may have been votives, offered ritually at watery locations as gifts for the earth and an invocation to deities to protect and preserve a shifting landscape. Sometimes, after storms, we find strange objects on the shore. Last year, glass onion bottles, still corked and containing dark winey liquid and marked with barnacles, washed up, miraculously intact despite 3 centuries in the sea. There are pockets of clay on one of the beaches where we find balls of marcasite, and for a while we were selling these to a crystal and rock shop in Broadstairs. And 2 years ago we found a concretion of shells, leather and iron, which we prized apart to find fragments of cannonballs and a cache of silver coins, Mexican silver dollars from the 1700s. A painting of unknown origin depicting a rose and a bottle of petals, thought to be Lamian. For a brief period in the 1800s, roses from Lamia, specifically Rosa rugosa, were very sought after in the French scent industry. The plants were first brought to Lamia in the 18th century as part of a cargo from China and immediately flourished in the salty maritime environment of the island. At the beginning of the 19th century, a merchant took some of the Lamian plants to François Rancé, a French parfumier, who used them to create a unique fragrance for the Empress Josephine. It was said to be her favourite of the many rose and musk perfumes she wore throughout her life. In summer, Rosa rugosa flower profusely at the beaches of Lamia. Their scent floats around the dunes, a sweet, delicate fragrance that is intoxicating. I can't pass a plant without immersing my face in one of the magenta blooms to glory in the smell. I sometimes wonder if Napoleon walked the gardens of his island exile, seeking out plants with sublime scents and trying to conjure up the aroma of his time with Josephine. In the middle of the island there is an old well of unknown origins, perhaps Roman, and still, thankfully, a source of fresh water from an ancient aquifer in the clay and chalk strata below us. We collect water in butts and barrels too. For power we have a generator, although we try to ration using it. We rely on our stove for heat, supplementing firewood with sea coal, which washes up plentifully on the beach throughout the year. A lot of time gets taken up doing chores, tending our animals, fishing, working our fruit and vegetable patch, keeping the house as storm and sandproof as possible. Sometimes we spend time with our neighbours, inevitably reminiscing about long dead family members and past village characters buried in the graveyard that surrounds the chapel. There are physical reminders of them. I have a treasured pair of strange patched gloves, passed down to me, used for a specific task, long forgotten. My family have lived here for centuries, and the sand and soil feels saturated with their presence. These ancestors have cast invisible threads over Lamia, binding me to the island. If I were to leave, I would be lost. On the mainland, New Downs Farm, the last farm before Sandwich Bay. A photo of my great-great-grandfather, James Smith, on horseback, herding a flock of sheep in front of the farmhouse. If you go there today, you can still see that building almost unchanged, and even now there's a small flock of sheep in the adjacent field. James Smith farmed here in the early part of the 20th century, and he was a renowned horse rider. Family history holds that he used to gallop across the bay each day on the huge horse he is astride in the photo. It is said that he used to ride the beast into the sea and it would swim. If the current was favourable, they would go through the water as far as the river mouth, a considerable distance. James Smith apparently could not swim himself, but had such faith in his horse's abilities that he would entrust himself to the sea in this way. My grandmother said that the horses at New Downs were of Lamian stock, and given the chance, would swim back there. Although our life is not easy, we love this watery landscape, the banks and furrows of briny grassland and the sand flats of samphire where egrets and oyster catchers scour the mud for food. Grey seals have colonised one of the beaches and we can walk amongst them basking at the shore until they lumber into the sea. The increasing rivulets of water threading over the land from the shore gurgle and trickle, and the reeds that spring up alongside them have become a new nesting ground for broody hens. In summer, the meadow grass on the island knolls is a cacophony of colours, full of orchids, chicory and poppies, and the sand dunes erupt with asparagus, fennel and viper's bugloss. Until the late 19th century, midsummer was marked on Lamia with bonfires and revelry, and flowers were garlanded around the houses and chapel. And in the heat of summer, the island glows, tightly clasped in the sun's embrace. We bask, languid and somnolent, moving in a dreamlike haze, all thoughts melted in the warmth of the sun's rays, our faces tilted skyward to receive its caress. On these days, even the sea is enthralled to the sun, the tide stroking the sand gently, alluringly, before retreating drowsily, glittering in the luminous light. And the original Lamian church was St Mary's and was dated from Saxon times, allegedly. It had a huge dragon carving in the centre of the tympanum, which some chroniclers believe represented the North Sea serpent Midgard. St Mary's was built close to the cliffs, and a succession of storm surges in the 13th and 14th centuries destroyed much of this eastern side of the island, so that by the 15th century St Mary's had been abandoned and St Margaret's Chapel built further inland. The last traces of St Mary's had disappeared by the time Edward Hastad wrote the History and Topographical Survey of the County of Kent in 1778, although the font and a curious holy water stoup, shaped like a scaled torso, were taken from St Mary's and installed in the chapel. Surveying the aftermath of the latest storm, a torrential drenching and battering has led to the reconfiguration of many sand dunes. They are squashed and pummeled, beaten down. Ominously, on the eastern beach, a new gully has appeared, a sly, snaking rivulet heading towards the island centre. And the channel separating the southern part of the island has widened further, so that the bank of marshy scrub which used to line it has vanished, submerged. But elsewhere the island is in defence mode. Huge banks of shingle have been reorganised and stand protectively behind the beaches. A large gaggle of Brent geese have appeared, swimming in perfect circles by the foreshore, restless, waiting for duty. Nearby, over 40 mute swans have gathered on a flooded field, as though an avian general has started mustering troops. The goats and sheep are camped conspiratorially in a corner of their field, like a medieval tournament. Even the seals seem to be linking together in the sea, as though creating a charmed ring around the Lamian shores. And the trees and reeds are blowing defiantly towards the sea, as if all the earthbound forces of the island are daring the waves to strike and standing ready to fight the force of the water. These Lamian threads and artefacts are believed to be relics from woad dyeing. The island was a small but critical early centre of woad dyeing, supplying the sandwich industry. The woad produced at Lamia was a very particular shade of blue, described by the 15th century merchant Thomas Paramore as the sapphire colour of the bounding tides. The woad dyeing industry continued on Lamia until the early 17th century, by which time woad was usurped by the import of Indian indigo, and sandwich had declined with the silting up of the Poasyum. It was said that on Lamia the woad dyeing season was used as an excuse for raucous drinking. The balls, which were mixed with hot water and urine to make the dye, were thought to have enhanced colour if there was alcohol in the urine. The dyed fabric was put out in the sun where, as it dried, it turned blue. Lamian dyeing took place on the beaches, and I can imagine sultry days where the island shimmered, cerulean, enveloped in swathes of fabric, their azure colour veiling the land and marrying the sky and sea. The Ellis family of Yarmouth have a Lamian mermaid on their coat of arms. John Ellis was an important 14th century merchant and was returning from a trading trip with Spain when storms in the channel drove his boat into the shallows of Lamia, where it hit a sandbank. A group of Lamian women who were dyeing wool with woad on the shore saw the sinking ship and began swimming to the assistance of the sailors, whilst Lamian boats were organised to come to the aid of the stricken vessel. John Ellis and his crew thought that the group of blue woad-stained women swimming towards their floundering boat must be mermaids. After being taken ashore, Ellis evidently became enamoured with one of his rescuers. Later, he asked the king, Richard II, for permission for his family crest to be a mermaid, in honour of the Lamian lady and the debt of gratitude he owed her fellow islanders. Self-tile fragments, taken from a fireplace in a flint house on the eastern Lamian coast, which fell into the sea in the 1930s. The property was known as the Rose House because it was built with money supposedly made salvaging cargo from the Roosevik, an 18th century Dutch East India ship sunk on sandbanks nearby. My grandmother had a dim recollection of an imposing but forlorn building that was emptied, fenced off, and eventually fell into a crumbled pile of masonry at the foot of the cliffs, before being consumed by water. It was thought that an early occupant of the Rose House commissioned these tiles especially for the property, asking that they depict the marine life located in the sea around Lamia. I imagine the aquatic bestiary that once surrounded flickering flames in the hearth of a vanished home. From huge whales to the tiniest of shrimps, all described in flourishes of May's glaze. The article makes clear that the pieces have no great value, just historical interest, but for me, the imagination and creations of a forgotten tile maker represent a ship, a house, the island itself, all taken by the sea, a litany of loss. I'm scrutinising an image of Lamian artefacts from a museum pamphlet. The article accompanying the text speculates on the relics as being ritual objects and connects them with the Isle of Thanet, where the soil was believed poisonous to snakes, suggesting they were offered to a Romano-Celtic earth deity for the protection of Lamian earth. I spend a long time gazing at the objects in the picture and trying to assign them each a function. The pointed glass and the presence of fossilised teeth and snakes makes me uneasy, as though a subtly menacing message has been sent to me across the centuries. An ancient Lamian legend talked of a sea serpent perpetually curled round the island, periodically consuming the land. It's as though this creature has reappeared from the depths of the sea and time, voracious, ready to eat more earth. A restless night. I'm like a vessel at sea, pitching, caught in waves of tangled sheets, submerged by half dreams. I wake feeling stranded, anxious. I get up, and even though it is very early, leave the house and walk towards the sea. It is a still, shimmering morning, so perfect it seems the rising sun is fervently determined to dispel my nocturnal uneasiness. When I reach the dunes, the tide is far out, and the beach has been transformed into a vast expanse of mud, which tugs at my tentative steps and sucks greedily at my boots, encasing them in sticky sludge. The mudflats have been cast with perfect ripples, the mark of the sea, proprietorial and possessive, laying claim to Lamia. Other Lamian artefacts from the same museum collection, strange objects that are coloured the green hues of the sea. I wonder if they are marine offerings, amulets to stop the invading water, and if their absence from the island is somehow calamitous. I yearn to handle them and to examine them, to imagine the ancestors who fabricated them, and then to return them to the island, to embed them in the Lamian earth, and to use them again as charms to protect my land from the force of the sea. Even in winter, when the winds can be brutal and the cold stabs at every pore, the island still holds you, compelling in its austerity. At night we are enveloped in darkness, no light except from the moon and stars and the occasional passing ship. We light our oil lamps and read, listening to the ocean. Sometimes I pore over my collection of old maps of the island, tracing its altered shape, described in ancient inky lines, reading the island name as that changes through the centuries too. The third island, Low Island, Infra Insula, Lamia. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was beautiful. That was absolutely delightful. Thank you so much.